Welcome, listeners. Imagine a quiet morning disrupted by a single phone call, one that unravels a mystery buried deep within the still waters of a secluded lake. A missing car, an unexpected discovery, and a truth so shocking it leaves even the police baffled. What started as a stolen vehicle turns into a web of secrets and questions no one could have anticipated. Stay with me as we dive into this unbelievable tale of loss, recovery, and the chilling revelations that followed. Nobody understood how Margaret's car ended up in this lake in the middle of the forest, but it quickly became clear that whoever dumped it here did not want it to be found again. The whole situation was shrouded in mystery right up until the trunk of the car was opened. Then it suddenly became clear to everybody what had happened. Margaret felt like she was on shaky legs as her car was being pulled out of the lake. It looked like it had not been in there for very long, but it had been gone for at least 2 months. At this point, where the hell could it have been in the meantime? Margaret would find out the disturbing truth very soon when she started to look through the car. When the police opened up the trunk of the car and Margaret saw what was inside, she nearly collapsed onto her knees while the police all jumped back in shock. The officers could not believe what they were seeing, but suddenly everything started to make sense. Tears started to pour down Margaret's cheeks as all attention quickly shifted to her. It was a typical Monday morning when Margaret got this unexpected phone call from the police. They announced to her that they found her stolen car nearby the forest lake. The truth is that she didn't expect to see her car ever again. It was 2 whole months without any news. She felt happy and relieved because at this time she could not afford to buy a new one. The day that these people stole her car was hard for her. She was in her living room watching TV. This was actually a day that everything was going great for her until this very moment. She suddenly saw the lights of her car come on. She was not able to do anything at this time. She only screamed from the top of her lungs, but no one heard her. Before she had even made her way outside, the car had already sped off. Margaret had no idea how they opened her car or what exactly happened. Her screaming woke up her husband, who had already gone to bed and was sleeping. They decided that the best idea for now was to call the police and report what had just happened. The day after that at the station, they reported her car stolen. The police informed her that this was something that apparently happened a lot recently. Margaret hoped that this meant they would know how to help her, but this was not the actual truth. As it seemed, they were not able to do much. Almost none of the cars that had been stolen in this manner had been recovered yet, so the odds of finding Margaret's car were not good at all. They had no idea yet who those people were or why they stole cars. All this time, it was not a simple case for the police, but they wanted to do anything to help Margaret find her car. After many days of trying to find a clue, the police realized that none of the cars had been seen in the area. So they speculated that the cars were maybe transported out of the state or even out of the country. Another big problem was that they had also not shown up on any cameras that were filming the roads leading out of the city. They concluded that it could be very possible they chose to transport those cars in huge trucks or something like that. But the part that did not make sense to them was that the cars that were stolen were not especially valuable, so using secretive transport like this could cost much more than the car itself. The police were shocked by the case, but they promised to add Margaret's car details to the list with the other stolen cars so they could keep an eye out for it. At this point, Margaret still had a bit of hope, but as the days were passing by, her hope slowly faded. She was waiting for a call every day, but the phone didn't ring at all. It had already been 2 months since Margaret last heard anything about her car. Suddenly, one morning, Margaret finally got a call about her car. She had actually forgotten about it at this point and was stunned when she picked up the phone. When she answered, she heard a really familiar voice. The person who called was an old friend of hers. She hadn't spoken to him for a couple of years now. The biggest surprise was that he called her about her missing car. She felt really relieved and happy because she believed that she would never find her car. Apparently, he had seen the post about the stolen car that Maragert had posted on Facebook. The photo had stuck in his mind for months, and he thought about it quite often. One day as he took his daily walk, he actually saw the car. He was really excited about this, so he decided to call her as soon as possible. For the first couple of minutes, she was ecstatic that her car had been found, and she wanted to go and pick it up immediately. But her friend had some bad news for Maragert. The car was not as accessible as Maragert thought at first. The friend described to her where exactly he had found the missing car, and Maragert started to lose hope again. He explained to Maragert that the car was not in a state where she could come to pick it up at all. The man encountered the car in the middle of a lake located in the local forest. At first, he couldn't recognize the car, but after a couple of minutes, he realized that the car was the same as Margaret's missing car. Both of them had so many questions about how the car ended up in the lake. This area was not even easily accessible, as no roads or anything were leading there. The biggest question was why the car ended up at this spot. Why did these people steal the car and then abandon it in the middle of the lake? Margaret's heart sank when she heard that her car was in the lake. She had already been compensated somewhat by the insurance company, so there was not even a good reason for her to go and get her car. After a while, she thought that this might be a useful clue for the police's investigation. Maragert knew that this case was very important for the police, and they were still working on it. She believed that this could be the lead that they needed. Plus, Maragert and now her friend were really curious about this whole ordeal, so she made the decision to call the police station and inform them about what her friend had found out. When she called the police, they told her that they were going to pick her up immediately to go and find the car. The friend who had called Maragert was going to be there as well. The police officer knew that this was their only chance to detect the whole mystery of the missing cars. As they already knew, this area was not easily accessible. The police cars couldn't make it to the lake, so they had to go off-road for a large part and make it through narrow passageways between the trees. It was not that easy to reach the lake, but they had to find out what exactly happened to this car. The police were baffled as to how somebody managed to put the car in the middle of the lake, so they started to doubt if Margaret's friend had told the truth about what he saw that day. Their main question was, why did they steal a car and then drive it into the middle of a lake? After a lot of thinking, the police already had a pretty good idea of why this car had ended up in the lake. The most believable conclusion was that the person who stole the car did not want it to ever be found again. The only thing they had to do now was to make it to the lake and reach the car. After 2 whole hours of trying, they finally made it to the lake. There, they met Margaret's friend and his dog. They quickly observed the car in the lake as well. So now, the only thing they had to do was to reach the car. They were so close to solving this case and finding out what really happened that day. The friend and his dog were still waiting for Maragert and the police. A tow truck was about 15 minutes behind them, but was having even more trouble traversing the difficult terrain. Why was the car left behind in such an abandoned place? Nobody could have guessed the true reason. Even though they could only really see the roof of the car sticking out above the murky water, there was no doubt in Margaret's mind that it was her car. She got more and more impatient waiting for the tow truck. She almost wanted to dive into the water to see if there was anything left of her car. One of the officers had already gotten himself into a diving suit. Somebody needed to get into the water to hook up the truck, but in the time they had to wait, he was already getting into the lake to get a better look at the car. The water was freezing cold. Luckily for Maragert, she didn't have to go in. He could not open anything so as not to let any more water flow into the car, but he could check out the outside and immediately notice that it was covered in scratches. The driver had apparently not been very careful while making his way through the trees. This was strange, as they had not seen any damaged trees on the way here, so they had assumed that the car had been driven here carefully. They made sure they checked the immediate surrounding area, but couldn't find any traces. The officer, who was still on the shore, started looking around and quickly found another path that did have some markings or scratched off black paint on the trees, but this path only led deeper into the forest. Why was the driver even there in the first place? While they were wondering about why and how the car had come from this direction, the tow truck finally arrived, and the priority became getting the car out of the water. Maybe that would give them the answers they were looking for. The true answer would shock them. The officer in the water attached the hook of the tow truck to the back of the car, and when they made sure that it was secure, the car started to get reeled slowly towards the shore. It was very heavy because the car had almost been completely submerged. Margaret could feel her heart pounding. She had accepted that the car was probably beyond repair, but she was hoping that not everything inside of it was ruined. She hoped to find her own items, but they would end up finding something very different. When the car finally made its way onto land again, it was a pleasant surprise to find that it had not completely flooded with water. Sure, a bit had gotten through, but from the seats up it was all still relatively dry. Could this mean the thief was still in the area? The car could not have been in the lake for very long, so the police took this opportunity to start dusting for fingerprints, as this could very well lead to a break in the car thief case. And what a break it would turn out to be. Margaret started feeling even more nervous. What was going on? While one officer was inspecting the inside of the car, the second one eventually got to trying to open up the trunk of the car. This was not easy, as Margaret's key did not seem to work anymore. It was probably because the car was pretty damaged. One officer grabbed his crowbar. He ended up using it, and after a few attempts, he managed to fully pop open the trunk, revealing its very surprising contents. Margaret was the first one to see it. Her mouth fell open, and she fell on her knees. The police immediately looked at Margaret, who was on her knees crying at this point, trying to get confirmation that she was not responsible for this. When she managed to give it, the officer immediately called for backup. The officer put on gloves before he dared to touch anything in the trunk of the car. Only when he laid it all out on the ground did they get an idea of the full scale of what they had found. Even the officers were very surprised by what they had found. They tried calming Margaret. In the trunk were bags full of water-damaged money and substances that would probably have been sold to make this kind of money. This could be one of the biggest local busts in recent memory. They certainly hadn't seen anything like this before, though all the officers wanted to do was follow the apparent route this car had come from to find out where it had come from. They had to wait for the backup, which arrived about 1.5 hours later. In the meantime, they did not touch anything. They still couldn't make sense of it. With 10 officers and 4 cars strong, they made their way through the narrow path until they eventually reached a small shed far away from civilization. Some of the cars that had recently been stolen were parked outside of it. They had probably found their thief. When they busted in the door, it became clear that nobody was there anymore. By the looks of this, they had made a good effort to erase all their tracks. Maybe they already feared that the police were on their trail. But as it would turn out, they missed a lot of details when making their getaway, and the police managed to collect a lot of fingerprints and even DNA samples from the shed and the cars. Now they got them. They knew they were going to find whoever was responsible. This quickly led to a few arrests, and in time, also to an explanation for what had exactly been going on here. Apparently, the shed was an illegal production lab, and also a base of operation for the local supplier and his crew of dealers. They stole cars that the dealer used to transport the money and products all the way through the forest. They had switch points on the outskirts of the woods where they would get into their own undamaged cars and sell out of those. They figured they could just steal cars for this, as nobody would ever find them in the forest. The supplier felt secure in his forest shed, but when one of his dealers got arrested recently, he got cold feet. This is why Margaret's car got driven into the lake. He tried to destroy all the evidence, which also included dumping a car with supplies in the lake. But in his haste, he had forgotten that there was also still money in there. The friend also got a handsome reward for their part in getting these people arrested. Margaret could buy a new car, and she was honored for her part in all of this. The first arrests, made in this case, led to a chain reaction, at the end of which everybody involved was going to get their day in court.